everybody. Thanks very much for coming to join us for this session on Pathway to Truth Telling and Treaty. And it's really lovely to have Kate with us. I'm called Kate. But Professor Emerita Kate Warner, former Governor of Tasmania, and long-term academic colleague here at the University of Tasmania. And in fact, Kate was one of my lecturers when I first came to the law school a long time before Gino was at Elizabeth College. 1978 was my first year here as an undergraduate law student, and I had the privilege of being taught by Kate even then. So she and I go back 44 years and been good friends ever since.
Thanks, Tim. As Gino was talking, I must say, I thought, well, I guess I never would have been governor if I hadn't done law.
That's true.
Yes. And I must say too, over the last few weeks, with things in the news, I thought I'm very glad that I did law if I was. So, the double thing there. There's news stories about toxic culture in Parliament. It's not something the government necessarily wants to hear, is it? No, it isn't. But also news about secret ministers and what the Governor General should have done or shouldn't have done.
Yeah.
It's been really interesting for me too, from a constitutional law point of view.
Yeah. I think it's the correct case, isn't it, that 6 graduates of this law school have been governors, including the current one.
Yes.
Barbara, I think, is the 6th.
Yes.
It's pretty impressive. But not that you have to, that the only way to be appointed Governor of Tasmania is to study law degree at the University of Tasmania. I don't think they go that far.
No, I don't think you said that.
I think for the purposes of starting off the session, really keen to have questions from you, because this is supposed to be a question and answer Q&A session. And we assume, for the purposes of getting into the subject matter, that most, if not all of you, have had the opportunity to watch the pre-recorded material that's on the website that was really a presentation that Kate and I gave to a group of first-year law students back in May this year. And I thought perhaps the best way to start off the session might be for us to reflect a little bit on what's happened since then in relation to the treaty and responses to it. We can give you a little bit of an overview about that and then ask you for questions for the rest of the session. Okay, any thoughts and reflections from you about what you would say now that we weren't able to say in May because it hasn't happened yet, about what's happened since then?
Yes, I can't quite remember whether it happened by May, but I was certainly really pleased when we heard that the government had continued with its commitment in relation to the abalone quota. So one of the issues with Aboriginal people for many years has been their inability to catch shellfish and sell it on the commercial market. So as Aboriginal people, they do have some Indigenous rights to gather shellfish without having a licence. They still have to abide by catch limits and whatever, but they can't use it in any commercial way. And one of the things we have been following in our report, doing our report, was the idea that there should be a commercial Indigenous abalone fishery using 40 units of the abalone quota that the government tenders each year. So they had indicated that perhaps they could be given or bought by the Aboriginal community. And that actually did happen when they were handed over after our report was finished, and that was really, I think, terrific.
It's good to
It's
see
really good idea.
something.
It's supported by the Indigenous Land and Sea Corporation. So I think they will get something like 9 tonnes of abalone each year from these 40 units. And the wonderful Dr. Emily has got a fabulous project on trying to have a sort of wave to plate concept. And they're hoping that because it's an Indigenous fishery that there will be a premium on these abalone and they will be sold to high-end restaurants and so on, and it will be successful business, Indigenous business. So that is a really interesting, and that's the kind of thing that is wonderful to see happening. So it's something that we talked about in our report, but it was really good to see that idea happen.
Yeah, it was great, wasn't it? Obviously, it was Premier Peter Gutwin that appointed Kate and I to support her in this project. And when he resigned from the premiership and retired from Parliament, we were a little bit concerned about, well, who's his successor going to be? Is his successor going to be as committed to this project as he clearly was? And we had a meeting with Premier Rockcliffe probably a month or 6 weeks after he'd been appointed with he and his senior advisors, and he assured us that he was as committed to the project as his predecessor was, and I think that's been proved to be the case.
Yes.
And one of the things that Premier Rockcliffe has tried to do is set up in late July, the last days of July, so just over a month ago, 5 weeks ago, he hosted a gathering of representatives of the Aboriginal people from around Tasmania to talk about, well, how do we go from here? What are the next steps? How do we implement the recommendations of the report? So there's certainly a process underway, although perhaps it's going more slowly than some of us would like. But yeah, I'm really happy to talk about any aspect of the report.
We could tell them about going to the Cooroona-Niara area too. That was something that we did earlier this year.
Yeah.
And I don't know, you might remember in the report, we talked about the possibility of having sort of Aboriginal National Park. So in terms of land, we have a system of reserves in the state. So there are 12 categories of land, and we thought it would be a good idea to add one idea was to add an additional category of land to have an Aboriginal National Park, not necessarily called that, but it could be at least a different category of reserve. And Tim and I went to the Cooroona-Niara area, which is in the Great Western Tiers, an area of land which the government is considering making Aboriginal land, but with a sort of national park style overlay, but not necessarily the same as national parks. So we had a terrific experience that day.
Yeah, if you can imagine, those of you, some of you might not know the road, but some of you certainly will. If you drive out of Deloraine, you go up over the Great Lakes, over the Central Plateau and past Great Lake, come to Hobart, or the south, up through Bothwell, past Great Lake and across the Central Plateau and down into Deloraine. We're talking about the land, the western tiers between the sort of edge of the plateau and the meander plains leading into the Meander Valley. It's currently a conservation area. It adjoins the Tasmanian Wilderness World Heritage Area, but it doesn't have the protected status of national park at the moment. And there is a group of Aboriginal people in Deloraine that really want to see this country protected, and they've put a submission up to the state government to establish the Cooroona-Niara, which is Polokani for mountain spirits, Cooroona Mountain and Niara Spirit, Cooroona-Niara National Park. Beautiful country. Tell us about going out with Uncle Hank.
Yes, so Uncle Hank took us out there with his cousin, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yes, and we had a wonderful walk into the national park with Uncle Hank and his brother, and just being there with them. Beautiful country, quite rocky and steep in places with caves, and they lit a fire there. That's one of the things they want to be able to do in an Aboriginal National Park, but obviously it's not something you can do in national parks normally, and they also want to be able to hunt. So it was really quite a spiritual experience for us to be there with them and to hear them talk about the time they've spent there and how they want to bring young people, Aboriginal youth, to have this place where they can actually go and appreciate and use. Yes, and they want to use it to a tourist potential too, so be able to take tours there. Yes, I think that is a really excellent plan, and we hope that that's supported.
We were fortunate to have the privilege of going out with him.
We were, yes. So it's quite a large area that the government government's considering doing different things with. It's, what is it, future potential forest production area, but they're not going to use it for forests probably. So some of it is actually going to be added on to an existing national park, but they're just deciding exactly what to do with this particular area. So that would be really good to see that happen. And whether it becomes Aboriginal land, so the Aboriginal Land Council administer it, but we rather hope that the local Denerean Aboriginal community will have the management of it. And it would really be a good example of having local Aboriginal people managing the land. But of course, we realise that they need support for this. So it's one thing to give back land to Aboriginal people. We've got to give back. We've got to be able to support them to manage that land as well. Because it's fairly clear, I think, that the Aboriginal Land Council isn't well enough resourced to manage the land that's been returned to them.
Yeah.
And joint management is something we became quite interested in, wasn't it,
Yeah.
as we looked at our country. So the same with Twa too. I mean, there isn't any joint management that's working properly at the moment. And that's conceded by the government.
Yeah.
That's not a secret.
TWA, the acronym is the Tasmanian Wilderness World Heritage Area, TWWHA. We use acronyms from time to time, but
yes, and you see we've got a list of them here, so to help explain. Yes, but that is quite interesting because there you've got, from a legal perspective, it's quite complicated, the TWA, because you've got state laws applying, you've got Commonwealth rules applying, and then you've got the international overlay as well, because it's a World Heritage Area. So it's quite interesting from a legal perspective how all of that works, but it makes it quite complicated.
it does. Yeah. Well, let's have some questions from you guys. I mean, most of you, perhaps not all of you, sure not all of you, most of you have chosen this topical legal issue, done some thinking about it, done some reading about it. What sort of questions would you like to ask Kate and I? Do our best to answer them. Let's start with you. What's your name?
Cecilia.
Cecilia. What school are you from?
LawFest College.
Thanks, Cecilia. When you've asked the question, either Kate or I'll repeat it for the sake of the recording. That's okay. Do that for everybody. Thanks.
We were lucky enough to meet Professor McCormack earlier this year, and you focused a lot about talking about the next question of Aboriginality. And you talked about the 2- and 3-pronged approach. What do you think about the government's response to the next question of Aboriginality?
So Tim, yes, great question. You're going to repeat it?
I will. So for the purpose of the recording, Cecilia's question is, she observed that Professor Warner went to Launceston College a couple of months ago and met with the legal studies students, and one of the things that she was talking about was what we call the vexed question of Aboriginality, the chapter of our report which tries to grapple with the question of identity, who is and who is not Aboriginal. And actually we try to separate our question of identity, which is a subjective personal thing, from eligibility. In our case, who is eligible to determine who will represent the Aboriginal people of Tasmania in negotiations with the state government for a treaty. You've got to be able to work out that question. And Cecilia's specific question is, in our report we explain the difference between the Commonwealth's 3-part test and the state government's 2-part test. And she's asking, what do we think about the way the government's responded to the recommendations we've made in our report about how to deal with this really challenging issue. That's the summary of the question. Is that fair, Cecilia?
Yes.
So let's answer it. Let's answer it.
Yes.
Want me to kick off?
Yes, you kick off, Tim.
So the 3-part test that we're talking about is a Commonwealth test for eligibility. So we're talking here about who is eligible to receive Commonwealth welfare payments, or who is eligible for appointment to a Commonwealth public service position that's designated for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. The three-part test is self-identification as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander, communal recognition, so an Aboriginal community organisation recognises that you are Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander, and thirdly, that you can establish proof of your descent from an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Island ancestor. In Tasmania, we followed that three-part test of the Commonwealth up until 2017, when then Premier Will Hodgman announced what he called a resetting of the relationship between the Tasmanian government and Tasmania's Aboriginal people. Premier Hodgman had spent the previous 12 months, not exclusively, his Premier used to do lots of things, but one of the things that he did across 2016 was travel around the state and meet with Aboriginal people all around Tasmania to listen to their issues and their challenges and their concerns and their hopes and aspirations for the future. And on the basis of his consultations, he understood that there was a lot of people in Tasmania who identified as Aboriginal but who were not accepted as such by one of the major organisations in the state. And the issue that many of them talked about was that there were all sorts of reasons why Aboriginality was hidden within families because of the shame associated with it. Kate and I, for example, had an incredibly moving conversation with an Aboriginal person in Latrobe who told us that when she went back to find out about her heritage, discovered that on her adoption papers as a child, her ethnicity was described as Indonesian and Maori, and she did her own sort of inquiry about that and came to understand that in the particular medical facility that arranged for her to be adopted out, the view was that the chances of her being adopted would be significantly increased if her Aboriginality was hidden because of the stigma attached in Tasmania in the 1960s and 70s with being of Aboriginal descent, which is shocking reality. And we had a few tears with her as she told us that story. So the reality is a lot of people in Tasmania believe that they are descended from an Aboriginal ancestor but struggle to prove it with documentary records because of these sorts of examples of Aboriginality being hidden. Premier Hodgman listened to many similar stories, and so he decided that in Tasmania the government would relax the eligibility criteria for employment in the state public service, for example, in a designated position for Aboriginal people. And so the two-part test in Tasmania now is self-identification and communal recognition. And the requirement of proof of descent is no longer required if you have a community organisation that's prepared to recognise you as descended from an Aboriginal ancestor.
And the problem is that some of the Aboriginal organisations aren't recognised by other Aboriginal organisations. And so they're saying that here we've got an organisation that's recognising something's Aboriginal and they're not even themselves Aboriginal, and Northern people have been recognised. So yes, so it's caused all sorts of problems and conflict within the community, and a lot of what is referred to as lateral violence within the community as well. So that was one of the things that Tim and I in our report thought needs to be sorted out by the Aboriginal community themselves. So that's why we suggested that the Truth Telling Commission, that should be one of its roles to decide how we're going to determine the question of Aboriginality, particularly when it comes to negotiating treaty and also in terms of the Aboriginal Land Council to be registered there. So we thought, yes, they should sort it out. And we did make this distinction that Tim mentioned between identity and eligibility. And that was a distinction that's been made before in legal cases that have had to decide these issues, particularly by Ray Broom in his decision. He made that very clear distinction.
Indeed, yes.
between, because when he said, look, you aren't eligible for compensation under the legislation because you can't prove your Aboriginality, but I'm not saying that you're not Aboriginal, I'm just saying you're not eligible. So he made that distinction between identity and eligibility.
It's a very helpful distinction, I think,
I
because
think it is a helpful
it takes a
distinction.
little bit of the lead out of how a person views themselves. How can I tell someone else that their identity is actually wrong? I mean, that's not for me to decide.
Yes, and the whole issue of documentary evidence is really difficult. It's clear that there probably are people who are Aboriginal that cannot establish it with documentary evidence. Sometimes there's such strong oral history that can be accepted.
Yeah.
But the documentary evidence is often really difficult to obtain, and we explained in our report how there's the view that there are only three possible lines of descent for Aboriginality or establishing Aboriginality in Tasmania. So it's either come from one of the Islander families, and then you can put very clear documentary evidence there, or you come from Fanny Cochran Smith, from her mob in the southeast. So that can be quite clearly established with documentary evidence. So Fanny Cochran Smith was the woman who she was born at Ivalena, wasn't she? And then after that, she went to Western Cove when the remaining Aboriginal people were moved to Western Cove. And she was allowed to marry. She married a convict and had 12 children or so.
Quite a few, yeah.
So there are many, many people who are descended from Fanny Cochran Smith. And then also we've got the Dolly mob in the northwest. So Dolly Dalrymple was brought up she came from the islands. They're both descended from Manawagena, actually, who was a chief of the Northeast Nation. But Dolly was brought up by the doctor's family in the northwest, and then she married a convict, and she had 12 children too. So the Dolly mob is a large mob.
Settled in the Trove.
Yes.
And so there's a very large Aboriginal community on the northwest coast. Most of them, or many of them, not most of them, perhaps many of them descended from Dolly.
Yes.
So there's this view that a more conservative and exclusive view about Aboriginality is that unless you are descended from one or other of those three lines of what are called survivability, three key lines of surviving the genocide of colonial authorities, then you can't prove your Aboriginality, or you're not Aboriginal. Some people of the more extreme view would say you're not Aboriginal. And then there is another view, which is a more inclusive view, that says, well, no, they weren't the only three lines of survivability, because there were Aboriginal people of childbearing or child-producing age who had relations with non-Aboriginal people, and their descendants are as entitled to their Aboriginal heritage as anyone else from the three lines of survivability. It's just really difficult to prove that because of the obfuscation of Aboriginality in documentary records.
Yes, so the Aboriginal children who may have been brought up by white families too. So that happened too. They were adopted and
given the names of the white family, the adopted family, as if they were biological children of that family. So how do you prove that actually I wasn't? I was adopted into that family. And adoption records only were kept systematically in Tasmania from the 1820s or 1830s. So anything prior to that, there's gaps in the record. So this is really challenging, and interestingly, so Celia, part of the answer to the question is long-winded, I know, but one of the reasons the government decided to reject our recommendation is because all the Aboriginal groups opposed it, and they did it for different reasons. This is what I think is fascinating about and why the issue is so tricky, so complicated. So if you're of the conservative view that there are only three lines of survivability, you don't want this issue opened up by a truth-telling commission, because you understand that if you do allow that, then you'll end up with more people entitled to call themselves Aboriginal than you accept.
Well, it could happen.
Well, that's the risk. That's the risk. And I
Yes.
think that they would, if they were honest, they could see it's pretty high risk.
Yes.
On the other side, if you're of a more inclusive, expansive view, you might not want to subject this process to a truth-telling commission because you could end up with fewer people than you currently accept as Aboriginal being actually able to establish to the satisfaction of the commission that they are entitled or eligible to call themselves Aboriginal. So, I mean, that's neither of those positions guaranteed, but that's a risk for both groups. They both opposed it, what we said, and said, no, don't reopen this. So now, the great divide, as we came to call it, on the question of who is and who is not Aboriginal, continues and will dog the processes that the government's trying to put in place. That issue's not going away.
And of course, the government's entitled to take that view. We already made recommendations, but it hasn't solved the issue.
And even if they adopted our recommendations, no guarantee it was solved.
Absolutely, of course not. Absolutely not.
Yeah, we thought this is the way it should happen. And I guess I felt quite strongly of the view that people who genuinely believe that they are descended from an Aboriginal ancestor who is not from one of the three lines of survivability ought to be given a fair hearing to make the case about why they believe they are Aboriginal. And an Aboriginal-led truth-telling commission would be a really good forum to be able to allow them to be given a fair hearing. But, the government has decided, no, we're not going to do that because no one supports it. Just these two academics we appointed to write the report. That's okay. No worries. Up to you. Any other questions? Up the back. What's your name?
Rosella from LawFest College also. So Peter Gutman was obviously very involved with the whole report and everything else. Since he was stepping down, has that affected your future plans and stuff to do with the report and everything else?
I don't really.
Repeat the question.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
You do it and then you can answer.
Yes. So the question is, has the change in premiership affected the outcome, the likely outcome of the report? I think in essence. So I don't think so, because I think that Jeremy Rockcliffe has really embraced the idea of trying to progress truth-telling and treating, and I think he's, as far as I can see, as committed to it as Peter Gutman is. So I'm hopeful that that will be. It's sad, I think, that Peter Gutman's not around to support him with that, or because both together they're very supportive of progressing these issues. So I'm sorry that Peter Gutman still isn't here to him, but I mean, I do think that Jeremy Rockcliffe is as committed as Peter Gutman.
Well, one of the things that Peter Gutman put in place that Jeremy Rockcliffe's continued was the bringing into the Department of Premier and Cabinet all the arms of government dealing with Aboriginal issues. So previously Aboriginal heritage was in the Department of Primary Industry, Parks, Wildlife and the Environment, the PIWI was the acronym. We had an Office of Aboriginal Affairs in the Department of Communities, Tasmania. We had various other aspects of government agencies that were in different departments. And Premier Gutman thought, well, I really want them under my Department of Premier and Cabinet so that I can make sure that we advance these issues with the whole of government involved, or whole of government that's relevant involved. And Premier Rockcliffe has certainly, continued that. So when we had our meeting with him, we met with all the senior leaders of that new division within the Department of Premier and Cabinet, and I thought that was quite encouraging. I think that's a good initiative.
Because we did find when we were doing our report that quite often they wouldn't know about
what each other was doing.
Yes, absolutely.
That's not unusual.
No.
That's good. Thanks for the question, Ray. Any Any others? You should
There
change
was another hand.
it, Mike.
Yeah.
Andy from Collegiate.
I think it's significant possible that Aboriginality is a commitment. How do you see your other recommendations proceeding?
Mandy's question, just for the recording, is that given how significant the challenges of the question of Aboriginality are, how are they going to affect other recommendations in the report?
Yes. Well, I think the truth-telling recommendations, I think they can go ahead. It just means that that particular function that we suggested for the Truth-Telling Commission won't be part of its function, but they have very important functions apart from that as well. So we wanted truth-telling to be about the past, about the present, and about the future. So there's no reason why that can't go ahead. And interestingly, when we think of the order of things, so if you go to the Uluru Statement, there the order of things was voice, treaty, truth. But when we spoke to Aboriginal people in Tasmania, they didn't think that that was the right order. They really thought that truth needed to come first, didn't they? It didn't, not that you have to wait until the truth-telling process was over to do voice and treaty. They could be concurrent, but they really thought that we should be starting with truth-telling. So I think there's no reason why that can't go ahead. And another recommendation we made in relation to truth-telling was to have really sort of overarching umbrella legislation which showed a commitment to truth-telling and treaty, so that the functions of the Truth-Telling Commission could be in relation to deciding what heads of treaty should be or whatever, or they could be in the legislation. So I think those recommendations can go ahead. I agree that in deciding who's going to negotiate treaty, the eligibility thing probably needs to be sorted, but if the government has sorted its way, well, maybe that is okay.
Yeah.
But yes, so I think certainly truth-telling can go ahead. And I think one of the really important things about truth-telling is for the community as a whole to understand the ongoing effects of dispossession, genocide and dissemination, the ongoing effects of trauma, so you know what you have to really, what you're dealing with, what you need to respond to. So we thought that truth-telling has to be about the future as well. There have to be tangible outcomes. Without tangible outcomes, any kind of commitment to this sort of pathway process will be lost. So I don't see why they can't go ahead. So it's not vital. I don't think it destroys the rest of the report. And there are many things that we say too in relation to land and sea too that can go ahead.
Yeah. In fact,
and heritage and education.
Also.
Language is another thing that's really that's very controversial.
It was, but we tried to say, we certainly told Premier Gallagher, we told Premier Rockcliffe that worst thing that can come out of the whole process is nothing, because Aboriginal people's expectations have been raised so high yet again with the consultations that we undertook. And we think it's actually really important that the government deals with what it can deal with that doesn't depend on the resolution of that issue, in the hope that making some progress. And I think the truth-telling things, like Kate said, is a really important example of this. Get on with the process of telling the truth. That's actually important for non-Aboriginal Tasmania as well as for Aboriginal Tasmania. And many, many Aboriginal people have said that to us. We've had so many conversations about the intergenerational consequences of dispossession and how widespread an overly simplistic non-Aboriginal view is that, well, it happened, 200 years ago, just get over it. No, you can't do that. We can't just get over it when our country was taken from us, our people were smashed, and we're living with the consequences of that. So we felt like this process of truth telling is really important for the whole of Tasmania, not just for the Aboriginal people themselves, but for non-Aboriginal Tasmanians to begin to understand, or to understand to a greater extent than we currently do, what the ongoing 21st century impact of what happened in the 1820s and 30s in this state really is for Aboriginal people. So yeah, we don't want to wait for that another 10 years, another 20 years.
And hearing stories of the stolen generation. So, you know, there are people my age who are stolen, and hearing their stories is just so tragic. And younger than me too. So, yes, your age, Tim. Yes, so that hearing their stories is just tragic, and what has happened to their family. So there is one man that I know who told me his story. He was stolen from Cape Barren Island, or he was taken away by the authorities. He was at school one day, and the authorities just came and took him away. He was taken first to Launceston and then to Hobart. He had no opportunity to say goodbye to his siblings or his grandparents who were caring for him at the time. And his story is just tragic. I mean, we just cried when I heard his story. And we heard other stories that made us cry, similar stories too, of children being brought up in totally inappropriate foster families, having been taken away from them. And it's just tragic.
It is.
But it's not only those families too, their stories are tragic, it's the hidden generation as well. So we heard of families who had denied their Aboriginality because of the racism and the treatment that they had in the community because they're Aboriginal. So they hid their Aboriginality, and now reclaiming it is really difficult, even if you can prove it with documentary evidence. You're still shunned by some members of the Aboriginal community because you've been through that process of denying your Aboriginality. And so that for them is really hard when they want to reclaim it, isn't it, Tim?
It really is, yeah.
Yeah.
I didn't really understand the hidden generation phenomenon. I heard about the stolen generation.
But we hadn't, yes. And, you know, they really want to reclaim their Aboriginality. And it can be really difficult.
Yeah. Mandy, we also thought that there's a number of things that the government could do, sort of easy wins or goodwill gestures that could be done to communicate to Aboriginal people that they're really genuine about advancing the process. And there are all sorts of things. The Cooperoo and the Yarra National Park idea is one of those, and there are several others. I mean, one of them that we identified in the report was the granting of the abalone quota. Give them to the Aboriginal people and show them that you're fair income back. Well, that's actually, that has happened, not because we recommended it, because a lot of work has been done in the years leading up to that. There are things like that, across a whole range of different sort of fields that the government could communicate to the Aboriginal people and to the rest of Tasmania that we want to change the status quo and we want to move ahead with the sort of thrust of what the report's about, whether or not specific recommendations are taken up and implemented. And I really wish that they'd get on with that, because a lot of those things could happen without trying to resolve the tricky issue of identity and eligibility.
So we thought, as well as the cultural fisheries idea, that it would be really nice to give to Aboriginal people, where they had Aboriginal land, rights over the adjoining area of cities. So you could have like a marine national park, we have those already. You could have an Aboriginal marine protected area where Aboriginal people could fish. So we thought that would be a good idea to have at Trumpeta Bay on Bruny Island, adjoining Murrayfield. So Murrayfield is Aboriginal, it's not Aboriginal land if it comes in the legal sense, but it is owned by the Wetapuna Aboriginal Corporation. So in that sense, it's Aboriginal land. So that would be great to have Trumpeta Bay adjoining there. And we also thought to at Musselroy Bay, where the NTWAC, the Mellathina, Tikama, Warriner Aboriginal Corporation have, I think now they've probably got the lease to that land. And the sea area there too would would be great to make that a sort of Aboriginal marine protected area.
The whole of things like that don't depend on the question of Aboriginality.
Yes.
Yes.
So how much does the state involve Aboriginals in land management generally, apart from these system corporations? Is there a shift, as there has been in WA and Victoria, to include Aboriginal knowledge and skills in land management?
So Mandy's question for the purpose of the recording is, to what extent does the Tasmanian government and state authorities involve or include Aboriginal people and advice and expertise in the management of land and water, and are we doing that in the same way that WA and Victoria is doing? So yeah, Kate, you want to start off on that?
Yes. So national parks do have Aboriginal ranges. They have a project for that, and so nationally there is. They've changed their names. They used to be called anyway. They have Aboriginal ranges, a project, a program that they fund Aboriginal ranges. So national parks have some that is funded by the Commonwealth, Aboriginal ranges, and on Cape Barren Island they have Aboriginal ranges, and the Aboriginal Land Council do get some funding too. So we have, I think, 3 groups of Indigenous ranges in Tasmania. So that is really helping, I think. And when we went to the National Parks centenary earlier this year, there was a fabulous talk by one of the Aboriginal rangers, Prof, wasn't there?
Jared.
Yes.
He's the head of the Working on Country Rangers program.
Yes.
He was fantastic.
Yes. It's not called Working on Country anymore. They've changed it. That's what it used to be.
Yeah.
But he talked about how his ambition was to be head of national parks. So there's some terrific Aboriginal rangers. We heard about problems in relation to it that I think some of them feel that they want to do more Indigenous Aboriginal work and less of the work that all of the other national parks rangers have to do. So there are some tensions, no doubt. But nevertheless, that is a start, isn't it? It really is a start. But what we heard from the Land Council was that they really don't have enough funding to employ enough rangers, put in enough training for them. But they are doing a lot of that, and they're doing cultural learning. And that is something that they've really had to revive. It was really lost in Tasmania, wasn't it? Yeah. But to a large extent anyway. So they're regaining that knowledge. And certainly down at Murrayfield, they are training Aboriginal people in cultural learning practices, and we're trying to really regain that knowledge, which is really, really good to see. And I think that the Land Council has done a great job in relation to that too.
Yeah.
We met some really impressive people associated with that.
That's one question. Did you have your hand up before?
I did. I'm
What?
Lily from Rosny College.
Lily from Rosny.
In your report, you talk about emotional support being available with an importance for avoiding re-traumatising Tasmanian Aboriginal people. I was just wondering, like, what sort of services would be put in place to ensure that, like, particularly regarding the stolen and hidden generations, extinction and colonisation.
Thanks.
So what's your name?
Lily.
Lily.
Rosny. Yes.
Yeah.
So Lily's question is, we talked in our report about whatever form the Truth-Telling Commission takes has to be done in a way that doesn't involve the re-traumatising of Aboriginal people who might want to come and tell their stories about what's actually happened to them or their families or the ongoing effects of colonisation on them. What will be done, what services are currently available, what will need to be available to be able to ensure that there isn't a re-traumatising consequence of a process that's put in place. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
You want to start off on that? Okay, we need to finish up in a few minutes.
Do we?
Technically, we've
Yes.
got 2 minutes to go.
But we didn't go into great detail about what what needed to happen. But certainly that's something we heard from so many people who talked about telling the truth, that it was really important to not just be servicing the rest of the community by hearing these stories, they had to be really protected. And I'm not quite sure exactly how that would have to happen, but I'm sure, you know, they'll have to take advice about how we do this best. Asking the Aboriginal people themselves what would best support them. You know, what kind of, where would you like to do the truth telling? Who would you like to be there? How should we respond? I think that, and I'm sure we could learn a lot from the Yuru Commission in Victoria about that, about what needs to happen.
Yeah.
And also about Aboriginal people themselves, who in many cases have needed a lot of psychological support because of the trauma they've suffered. So they would have an idea of what would be necessary to support people telling their story. I don't know, Jim, have you got anything to add to that?
Well, probably not because of the time.
Yeah.
I mean, one thing perhaps I could just say to finish up, we've heard a lot from people about the modality, the way in which Commission conducts its hearings needs to be culturally safe. And what people meant by that when we tried to unpack it with them was not in a courtroom type building, you know.
No cross-examination or, you know, the sort of thing that's happening in the Commission of Inquiry at the moment. Certainly not that.
Possibly out on country, possibly in a yarning circle, an informal process that allows people to speak and be heard, that doesn't involve them being challenged. So I think there are ways that could happen, and it'll have to be, like Kate said, I mean, not only creative and innovative, flexibility on the part of those involved in running the commission, but a great deal of listening to what Aboriginal people want that would enable them to feel safe and supported in the process. It's 11:50. I'm really sorry we didn't get to your question. And thanks for the questions that you've asked. We need to make our way back into Law Theatre 1 for the session on referendum. So let me just say thanks